That's all the logic there was to the relativity.
But it wasn't easy to get, and Ngaai Tahu got a relativity clause.
I didn't get it until I was with Bolger, and he said, you can't have more than Bob. And I said, well, I haven't got a couple of harbours and a big river. You're still not getting more than Bob. And this is Bolger and I one-on-one. And I said, well, Bob's got relativity. Right, you can have relativity. Done.
E mihi ana ki a koe e te rangatira, ki auraki maunga, ki Ngaai Tahu, me o mahinu nui, kei wainga nui i a Ngaai Tahu ara ki te ao Māori. Nō reira tēnā koe, tēnā tātou.
E mihi atu.
Thank you for agreeing to have a bit of a kōrero. And part of the conversation is really around trying to understand your reflections and recollections about the period just before the treaty settlement negotiation process started. And I was wondering, in your time of working through political discussions and negotiations around the Fisheries settlement, what was happening at the time?
Well, there was a range of things, I think, that are quite important to remember before we move into that thing. By way of background, the history of Tainui Waka and the Tainui Māori Trust Board is very different from the history of Te Waipounamu, Te Wako Aoraki, and the Ngaai Tahu Māori Trust Board, or Ngaai Tahu, as I'd say, if I was sticking firmly to my southern dialect. But the important thing to remember is Waikato, Tainui, and parts of Taranaki suffered actual military confiscation of their lands. Whereas Ngaai Tahu's whole case was basically for non-performance of contract. And we started litigating it in 1849, a year following the Kemp Purchase, which is the biggest single land acquisition by the Crown from Māori over Aotearoa. So the base both our peoples were coming from was quite different. Those who had suffered military occupation and confiscation on grounds of rebellion, and our case, which was all to do with the nature of contract and non-performance on contract, and a failure to match their promises by delivery of inclusion. So conceptually, our wrongs were different, although in effect they were similar. That was one thing that was not often understood by northern iwi who were starting to make a push on the Crown for some kinds of remedies and what we were able to do. For instance, the payment to the Tainui Māori Trust Board, Taranaki Māori Trust Board, was perpetual. Ours was limited to 30 years. I was already starting to cause trouble. In 1973, I found myself on the Ngaai Tahu Māori Trust Board. By a very short time later, I'd become chairman, and I was, in 1976, I was able to get the Ngaai Tahu £10,000 a year compensation payment moved into perpetuity. We disposed of the whole structure in 1986. At that time, it was a very different situation from the one in which Te Kotahi was facing and those things. And conceptually, the worlds were of tension and interaction with the Crown were quite different.
So while the trust boards became a vehicle to help progress claims, and for Ngaai Tahu, albeit a very different starting place to Waikato as you've demonstrated, the context around moving towards a settlement process that resolved historical wrongs was quite a challenging shift in terms of the mindset of the Crown at the time.
Oh yes, indeed,
yeah.
indeed. And I have to say, Maturata's principle, what the French call eminent grise, the grey eminence, Cardinal Richelieu, Maturata's grey eminence was Pat Hohepa, later Sir Patrick Gomate Naine. And he ran Maturata's office when he was the Minister of Maori Affairs, and he had a profound influence on the movement that was being undertaken towards reparations. I think that's fair to say. Matt was the front line of it, but the work was being done behind him in his office by Pat Hohepa.
So you would observe that Pat had an influence in devising the concept of the Waitangi Tribunal?
Oh yes, absolutely. And he was a very shrewd advisor. Whilst most people just saw he and Ranginui Walker out fishing in Ranginui's boat on the Gulf, Pat was a very different sort of operator from Ranginui. And he did a lot of the scripting for the shift towards the Waitangi Tribunal and eventually the establishment. And he had quite a hand in the thing that moved it across to the amendment, which gave it the capacity to deal with historical claims.
Well, let me come to that, and because Koro Wetere was the Minister of Māori
That's
Affairs.
another key factor in the triangle.
And with the retrospective nature of the tribunal being able to hear claims dating back to 1840,
Yeah.
what were your recollections of the role that Koro played?
Oh, Koro was,
in and around
Koro
that
was
time?
absolutely essential. I can remember various conversations with David Longy, for instance, jokingly put it about strong pen left weeping around the cabinet table and Koro walking out of the meeting with a self-satisfied smile. Koro was a key figure in those things, and he, of course, he was totally, absolutely staunch and loyal to Waikato Tainui and to Te Kotahi in particular.
And when the tribunal's remit had been broadened to consider historical claims, how did Ngaai Tahu respond in terms of preparing for the next push towards resolving those historical injustices?
We were all set to go because we've been working on that history for some considerable time. We'd had this huge long-running battle, which is detailed in the Ngaai Tahu annual reports, over what we called Otago place names. It was a fight with the ODT, the Otago Daily Times, to start with, but that engaged us, and Koro Wetere was Minister of Lands. And so before too long I found myself appointed by him to the New Zealand Geographic Board. And not long after that, we had a further amendment whereby, with the Ngaai Tahu settlement, Ngaai Tahu sent its own representative to the New Zealand Geographic Board, which was not unreasonable because roughly 50% of New Zealand's place names are in the Ngaai Tahu takiwa. And that started another whole set of relationships for us with Wharehui and Milroy. And that led us to his associate, Timothy Karatu, who we'd already been negotiating with and discussing things with because of my own relationship with the late John Rangiho, who was a key figure in much of our thinking during that time. He was thought of as probably the most important person in New Zealand, and by many, Māori or Pākehā, such of that he was a Tory to his bones. But John Rangiho, when Whina Cooper was arriving with her great hikoi, the Māori Land March was arriving at Parliament, Matt, he said, didn't want to go out to face her, Maturata. And he said, well, it's not right. Taitokoro can't go out and meet Te Taitokoro. And so he handed it over to Te Rangiho. I remember Apirana Mahuika and I, Apirana Mahuika of Ngāti Porou, and I hiding behind a shrub somewhere in the parliamentary grounds, listening to John. And John's address that day was absolutely outstanding. He was an extraordinary orator. And I remember Api turning to me and saying, kia mau te wehi, kia mau te wehi. And Api just kept repeating it, watching John at work, which was quite a bit because Api considered himself inferior to very few people.
There were a number of personalities around in Māoridom who influenced political thinking at the time. And I'm wondering whether you can recollect some of those crucial conversations and interactions between tribal leaders and politicians that started to shift opinion around resolving treaties.
Well, Te Rangiho had a huge influence on Duncan McIntyre. And that led to my ready acceptance by Duncan. And another one of that day, there was two Ngaai Tahu men in the Muldoon corner, Ben Riwai Couch and Rex Austin, MP for Awarua. Now, Rex being a somewhat tangential relation of mine, I had a high regard for him, and Rex and I had a major influence on reshaping the TT Island regulations when they came before the Regulations Review Committee. And that's when I first really engaged with him. But we also had the influence of Ben Couch, which was quite considerable because he was stuck with the longest running bill in New Zealand parliamentary history was the Māori Affairs Bill. It went on and on from government to government, and it was finally put to bed in its various forms, quite usefully. But en route to that, Ben had a very considerable influence. But it was those two guys dealing with people like Young, the Minister of Works, father of Audrey Young, I think, the journalist. And they devised backed a plan devised for the Takahanga lands at Kaikoura, which I was battling on for the late Rangi Solomon, who was an uncle of Whetū Te Rakatani. So these webs come together. And David Gascoigne, who was a lawyer at that time, and is now Sir David Gascoigne, the husband of former Governor-General Patsy Reddy. David Gascoigne devised a model by which we could have the land on the reserve at Takahanga. It was a National Historic Reserve. It could be reserved under the Public Works Act for the purposes of a marae. And that overrode all the objections of the District Council and rode over all its authorities, and we got that remaining land for Takahanga back in that way. Well, Bill Young was the Minister of Works, and I remember the day which he said to me, well, my two fellow Ngaai Tahu, Ben Rewai Couch, and Rex Austin were present. He said, Rex and I are going for a cup of tea and Ben can go and have a Milo, and I'll see you back in here in 30 minutes. Just show me where to sign. And they duly returned, and the Minister of Works signed the order. And that's how we got the Takahanga Marae Kaikoura underway. And that's why we celebrated the deed of settlement being signed at Takahanga.
That's good history. Can I move your thoughts to that period of time just before the fisheries negotiations started? Because it seems to me that's a pan-Māori settlement.
Oh, absolutely.
And it preceded the Treaty of Waitangi negotiations.
Yes, that's true. The main set of proceedings were before Justice Laurie Greig, or Greig, Greig. Anyhow, the Greig decision basically said that it was using Ngaai Tahu evidence, and the Ngaai Tahu Māori Trust Board actually funded the litigation on that particular case, because every time the Crown moved to bring in the quota management system from 1986 on, the Māori team would file under David Baragwanath would file. He would say, simply unlawful, because the main Fisheries Act said, Section 88.2, said nothing in this Act shall be done to disturb Māori rights. And on that basis, they'd serve injunctions and seek an injunction in the court against the Crown for introducing another species into the quota management system, which they'd brought in. They bought this thing a couple of inches thick. The whole quota management system was introduced into the House by way of an Amendment Act. And that was another bit of a problem. Anyhow, Section 88.2 of the main Act was our linchpin. And the Greig decision was the decision which said that Māori fishing rights were clearly of a commercial character as much as they were of a customary non-commercial character.
Because prior to then,
That's been the Crown's position.
Prior to then was the opinion of the Crown that it was only Māori only had customary
rights. And we won that case, the Wellington High Court under Justice Greig. It's a classic case, and his ratio, as they say, the rationale for the whole thing, is a very long decision, beautifully expressed, I might say. And I think it's one of the most important legal decisions in our history.
Can you recall some of the conversations more local within Ngaai Tahu or across the motu with regards to this, what was happening in the fisheries space?
Oh yes, we had a strong position. We'd also had the Te Wehi case in the south. Tom Te Wehi was a from Whanau Taupere, from Tokomaru Bay, Ngāi Tahu. And Tom Tawehi was living in the south, and he got caught up at Motunau with a couple of Pākehā mates by a fisheries inspector with an overweight bag of paua, amongst other fish. And they got taken to court. Pākehās pleaded guilty. Tom pleaded not guilty on grounds of his treaty rights. As the judge laughed, fined the lot of them, so it went to appeal. And the case before Justice Williamson in the Christchurch High Court was won by Tom Tawehi. And we were heavily involved in that by our Ngaai Tahu leaders writing to affirm that they'd given Tom Tawehi permission to fish within our takiwā, that he had customary rights there because they were granted to him by Ngaai Tahu.
Can you piece together the move from the legal action that Ngaai Tahu took, the Tom Tawehi case, to shifting into the direct negotiations process, and how the four lead negotiators got around the table?
The Greig decision came after that, after Tom Tawehi. And after that, Richard Prebble was the Associate Minister of Finance, and he was put in charge of a committee on which Sir Graham was sitting. I think there was 6 of us in Prebble's office, and Cora was having a quiet nap in the corner in this round of negotiation. Prebble put his proposition, and I can't recall just what it was, but Sir Graham, I can remember Sir Graham saying, well, we'll have to take this back around the people. And Prebble thumped the table. He says, there are 6 people in the Maori world that I've got to talk to if I want to get anything done with you lot. 4 of you are sitting here. Now deal, Latimer. And he exploded. Cora suddenly woke up and took close attention. But that was following that, we had the Wallace Committee on Maori rights. Justice Wallace was the judge who chaired it. And Justice Wallace was, you may remember, had chaired the Royal Commission that brought in an MP. And he chaired this committee, which had 4 people from Treasury, a fellow called Fred Baird, another wonderful man from Treasury, I've just gone and lost his name, representing the Crown, and myself, and Bob should have been there, but Bob said, well, sea fisheries is not my thing. And he engaged Denise Henare, a practicing lawyer, niece of Sir James Henare, and I think she's now retired as a judge. Denise and I, Matthew Rata and Ty Graham,
So it would have
were
got
the team, and that committee was then faced with working through this logjam in fisheries and Maori fisheries rights.
And was the National Māori Congress established at the time?
The National Maori Congress was built on the initiative of Sir Hepi Te Hehe, and at whose tangi this was, toko was given to me. And the National Maori Congress was his initiative, and he wanted us to be funding ourselves and not taking a funding from the Crown the way the Maori Council did.
Can I maybe go to a point that's come up in your kōrero around yourself, Sir Graham, Denise and Matt starting to piece together the fisheries settlement.
Oh, yes, yes.
And you, in the conversations, there was a mana moana principle and a mātātoru tangata principle in terms of
Yes.
how to fairly consider commercial quota and a pan Māori settlement. I'm really curious as to how those conversations or positions transpired.
With great difficulty. Sir Graham wasn't particularly fussed. Neither of them were particularly fussed about the population case. That was being urged by John Tamihere, and the population case was being raised by urban Maori authorities, the UMA group. And they were arguing for a macro settlement. Ngaai Tahu was arguing for a coastline system on the basis that your rangatiratanga existed in the waters off your coastline. And of course that was a big area for Ngaai Tahu, but all Ngaai Tahu's big quotas were in the deep sea, whereas nearly all the top end of the north particularly, their quotas were up in the Kermadecks to some degree, but mostly inshore and a very, very high level of snapper. Now, there's practically no snapper at all off the Ngaai Tahu coast, or wasn't at that time. There's a bit of it starting to show up now with climate change. But typically, Māori commercial fishing interests, Māori perceptions and understandings was familiar with the waters off their particular tribal coast. They didn't know anything about what was off ours. And a lot of our inshore people had no idea of it. But we had people who were deeply versed in those further things. So we were particularly hostile to the idea of having all the deep water quota designated by the Crown as being available for population use or population-based allocation, and the inshore quota being allocated on a coastline basis. And that division was pretty strong, because what the effect was, even to this day, Ngāpuhi hold more deep water quota off the South Island coast than Ngaai Tahu does or Kahungunu do, which is a nonsense. But it's one of the effects of the fisheries allocation rules.
You must have had some animated or passionate interactions amongst yourselves as negotiators.
Oh, some of them terrible. They're terrible. It's terribly difficult. We finally found some compromises. Major players in this was Donajuri Hall, who was acting as a lawyer for Sir Graham. Donajuri Hall, of course, was the wife of the president of the Waitangi Tribunal at the time and the chief judge of the Murray Land Court. And then he went to the High Court, and we were up against it from our point of view. But the debate was fierce. I can remember when I went to whenever I went to a meeting of the Māori Fisheries Commission, or the annual meetings, and Major Hui to do with fisheries with iwi, I always had Joe Wakefield or someone walking behind me. I never went out without someone following me around at my back, protecting me, because the stuff was violent and fierce. And it wasn't all iwi, or it wasn't all Māori. There were all sorts of others in it.
So the attitudes at the time, the misunderstanding, the myth-making, the cartoons in the newspaper and things like that, what people were making up about what the fishery settlement represented, is there anything that stands out in your mind about how ill-informed New Zealanders were around these issues?
Well, New Zealanders thought that fish, they knew they came from the sea, but fish to them was a fillet laid out on a fish shop counter or window. That's what they thought fish was. It was like New Zealanders who still think electricity comes from a switch on the wall. A lot of people, their mind stops at the switch on the wall.
But there would have been...
And the fish is like that for a lot of people. And people in Dunedin and far south think there's no other fish beyond blue cod. And if you're on the Kaikoura coast, there's 6 months of the year in which you think there's nothing better than hapuka.
But there would have been some fear, surely, at the time about rights to Māori for fisheries.
Well, rights to Maori fisheries were, the hostilities were enormous. The day, I can remember washing my car in the corner of top end of Bidwell Street in our little drive. It was only a car length long. And cars would come past, I hear a toot, and you look around, there'll be someone giving you the fingers, two-fingered salute out the door. Windows would be wound down and abuse would be shouted out the window at you. I can remember when Hannah was still in a bassinet. She was in a room and I received news about, it was in the media, I think I was made National Business Review's New Zealander of the Year or something. And I rang, as soon as I heard about this, I rang Sandra and I said, get that baby away from the nursery window. I think we were at about an hour or so later, after my call, a brick came through that window and landed exactly where the bassinet should have been, with our baby in it. Well, you and she are both of a similar vintage, and so you know how far back that was. And it was a pretty nasty period when that sort of thing was going on.
There must have been a real sense of urgency that something had to happen. Was there a turning point in the fisheries negotiations where, as negotiators, you all decided it's time, we've got to do it?
I always date the turning point from the Grieg judgment.
Okay.
That's when Preble was told by his colleagues, you've got to do something, because he'd been put in charge of the matter.
But
he was Associate Minister of Finance. And not long later, change of government, and we had Bolger and Doug Kidd. Now, it wasn't particularly... Kidd was a distant, well, not entirely distant relation of mine. Our grandparents, my Pākehā grandmother's side, had come to New Zealand on the same ship, and they were brothers. And they were both buried alongside of each other in the Richmond Cemetery at Nelson.
So you had relationships across Parliament by the sound of it.
Indeed, I did. And Doug Kidd and his team were brilliantly supportive of a reasonable outcome to the fisheries.
But not all iwi agreed. Was it Api that took a contrary view about whether or not the settlement was...
Bob's view had been, he's quite frank about it. He said, these sea fisheries are not my thing. So he sent Denise to work with us. And that brought us to a point where we had this committee under the leadership of Justice Wallace, and we both brought down different reports, as I was saying. And the report that I fronted, I was sitting with Motu, Sir Graham, myself, and Denise at the head of the Legislative Council chamber. And the room was packed with the greatest and the good to Ngaai Tahu was there, Sir James Henare was there, a whole string of leaders from across both islands.
Can I ask, did the fisheries settlement achieve everything that you believe as a negotiator you had set out to try and ensure would be secured to Māori by participating in commercial fisheries?
No, I had hoped we could get there. We had two settlements. There's the 1989 settlement and the 1992 one, the one that people call the Sea Lord settlement. They both had this unpleasant aftertaste from our point of view. We had these fish classified as deep water on our coast, all being held by Ngāpuhi. Ngāpuhi weren't fishing them, they were leasing them off to Pākehā to fish. And they didn't come down south and catch those fish. It was to do with the coastline population thing and the classifications. They were unsatisfactory. So we had, in the end, a very finely balanced set of compromises. But we got there. And I have to give credit to the various people who assisted us in bringing those compromises together, because it achieved some very important principles, and one was that our earlier commercial experience in fisheries rights, exercising our fisheries rights, were confirmed and accepted by the wider society. It's often forgotten that we were, Ngaai Tahu in the far south, were exporting to Australia fish, preserved fish, to the Sydney market. At the same period, the Waikato was exporting all the wheat out of Auckland to the Sydney market. And there's an argument by some that the land wars in the north broke out when the Sydney, Port Jackson and New South Wales, they became self-sufficient in food. They weren't interested in trading from, importing from New Zealand. They were looking after themselves, and the consequence was that Waikato found it hard going and there was increased Pākehā pressure on their lands. There's a whole thesis of the origin of the land wars, at least in the Waikato.
It is a thesis in itself. Let me perhaps move to what I observed, because after the fisheries settlement, yourself and Sir Robert both moved towards your own claims for Waikato and for Ngaai Tahu, and took very different approaches. So I'm wondering, 30 years after your respective settlements, what your observations were around negotiating an outcome and what your hope was at the time, and has it been realised?
Well, Te Kotahi was able to take the opportunity for a royal visit impending, and the night before the Queen of England was due at Ngaruawahia, Douglas Graham, the minister, and Te Kotahi went for a walk and a smoke down the side of the river. He put the hard word on the minister regarding what came to be called the relativity provision. He said, if we go first, how are we going to be penalised in proportion to other people? And Doug Graham conceded. That's all the logic there was to the relativity.
But it wasn't easy to get, and Ngaai Tahu got a relativity clause.
I didn't get it until I was with Bolger, and he said, you can't have more than Bob. And I said, well, I haven't got a couple of harbours and a big river. You're still not getting more than Bob. And this is Bolger and I one-on-one. And I said, well, Bob's got relativity. Right, you can have relativity. Done. I tucked that away and I got my pounamu, my rights, mineral rights to pounamu. That was a crown mineral.
Also, Ngaai Tahu innovated cultural redress
Indeed.
with the settlement because Waikato didn't have cultural redress
Yes, I know.
considered. So how did you innovate that aspect of your settlement? What informed your thinking there?
Well, we brought that in as much as anything on the back of the fact that the original contractual deals, we had a whole place for schools and hospitals, none of which eventuated. And it was under the umbrella of cultural associations with place and significance of cultural relationships with place. For instance, there was a swamp called Taipatu up at just North Canterbury, out there beyond Tuahiwi. Now, that happens to be the place where Tahi, our tupuna with a lame foot, who built the great Kaiapoi Pa, made, I always say, he invented the idea that was copied by Raffles in Singapore, because he got the traffic north, south, east, west, and Kaiapoi became the great centre of Ngaai Tahu development and growth. But Tahi's buried in that swamp, and we wanted to secure it. Well, Doug Graham didn't have a clue about what Taipatu was. He tried to look it up in a dictionary, and he asked me one day what the hell it's about. I said, oh, it's a cultural matter, because I didn't know.
But cultural redress is so important.
Well, cultural redress, I know, but there was things like that that we introduced into the negotiations. I had Taipatu Pounamu, which is one of our great treasures, with its own story, and those things were all covered with cultural association.
30 years after the Ngaai Tahu settlement, what do you hope Mokopuna will reflect on as the most important learning aspects of the journey you've been on?
Well, the first thing I think is I inherited a route rather than I didn't start the journey. The journey started in 1849 with the first appeal by Matiaha Tiramorehu to the Crown. That's where we date Te Keremi o Ngaai Tahu from, 1849. It's the longest running such piece of litigation in New Zealand history. And the things that we had in it were schools and hospitals and lands and mahinga kai. So the mahinga kai takes us to the environment questions. That takes us to fresh water. It takes us to plants. It takes us to the areas where only the torupapa, the keke, torupapa grows from the ground up, not up in the top of a tree with a long root. It takes us to all sorts of treasures in the environment. The Maika Kai thing is very inclusive in concept. That was very much a part of the cultural component. People would say to us, why do you want that? Want it because that's where our tupuna were buried. Or we want this thing because that's where something else was gathered.
Another point of difference between the Ngaai Tahu settlement and the Waikato settlement was the step you took to legislate the governance te runaka o Ngaai Tahu in advance of the settlement. I'm wondering how that worked for you.
That was largely the result of realisation that I'd had brought to me by the late Paul Tim, who was our QC. He made the point to me that all of our authority, all our tino rangatirataka, all of these things were traced to being a gift of Parliament. He always argued these are inherent rights derived. Your mana whenua is not something that's gifted to you by Parliament or by any democratic system. It's an inherent right in your treaty rights. And so on that basis, we had a separate tribunal report. We had something of a stellar tribunal. Not many Waitangi tribunals have been assembled with this range. And Professor Hugh Carpenter, Sir Desmond Sullivan, who'd been the head of the district courts. These were all on our tribunal. And they agreed with us about the idea of Ngaai Tahu's legal personality. So when I've been asked what's the most important thing I've done, I said, I believe the most important singular thing I've done has been an achievement of the recognition by the New Zealand Parliament of Ngaai Tahu's legal personality as a people. And so I can legitimately say the Ngaai Tahu nation within Aotearoa, New Zealand. That's not much different from the state of Nebraska or a state within the US Union, or indeed the situation of Northern Ireland or Wales or Scotland and their legislatures in the United Kingdom. But it is a status that from which a whole lot of things conceptually can flow. We are not the creature of Parliament, we are the partner of the Crown.
I want to move you to your reflections on people, starting with Sir Robert. And intellectually, politically, you had I would say, a layered relationship, and you've worked alongside each other and held each other to account in different ways and debated with each other. But what are your strongest reflections in terms of the relationship with Sir Robert?
My relationship with him was most strongly shaped by my personal respect for those who brought him into a relationship with me. So he came with the backing of Pei Tahunui Jones, the late Horry Forbes, who was a seminal person for me. And because he was theirs, he was Te Aue's. And Te Aue was so important to us. So Bob had this around him, where there was always a mutuality of respect, a certain amount of hard-on stuff. Why did the National Business Review, cross-examining them on the Tainui settlement, why did you move at this time? Well, says Bob, we faced the prospect of me driving down the road in a Ford and Tipene driving down the road in a Mercedes. And I couldn't have that. And the buggers quoted us.
You were both strong personalities during that period of time of negotiation.
Oh, yes. But there was always a mutuality of respect. And a mutuality, I had the most warm relationship with Taitarangi Kahu. But I was always very impressed when I go up to Hopu. I'd go drive into the car park and I'd go across to the centre of the car park and make my mihi. It always makes me chuckle because he said, I'm not going up on Taupiri.
Yeah.
He said, He said, I've got to go to Hopo Hopo. I said,
Have his own hill.
I said, what the hell for? He says, so they can never sell it. And I thought, yeah, that is the shrewd strategist from way back, and I intend, to the extent I'm able, to emulate his example.
Is there a robust debate that you can remember having with him on matters of principle that you would like to recollect?
I think the most fruitful one was one we had around this general question of the legal personality of an iwi and why it mattered. He was inclined to be a bit dismissive of it. Certainly didn't come to blows over it, but it was a robust argument. He said, we are because we are. And I said, we are because we are, but it's important that other people recognise that we are. The last time I had the honour of sitting on the maho with Tuheitia, it was time to do a lot of thinking while other people were doing a lot of talking. Mm. And I was thinking much of these relationships and why they were important. Mm. And on 2 or 3 occasions now, I've been placed on that honoured role. It's one way of keeping me quiet. And other people do the legwork and the heavy lifting. And I think as I've been there, sitting there in that reflective mode, I've thought a lot about those relationships. My relationship with Taa Tipene, my relationship with Te Kotahi, Tātarangi Kāhu Pei Te Huanui, Tā Tiemi Hianari. All of those relationships that have cross-hatched my memory.
What are the enduring characteristics of leadership that you believe must be nurtured within Māoridom going forward?
A clear understanding of where you're from, who you are as a people, and where you, as a person, fit in that mesh of relations. Some people are only marginally associated despite their genetics. Others are deeply associated despite their genetics. But I think it's very important, because if you don't know where you're from, you don't know where you're going. If you don't know where you're from, you don't really know who you are. You're more than a name on a birth certificate. You are a walking piece and part of a heritage which one hopes will continue. And I think that is a central question. And all of these other things flow into it and out of it.
Can I ask how you came to know or meet Sir Robert?
I'd heard about him, quite a lot, there'd been a lot of reference to him before I ever met him, because my associations with Waikato Tainui had come about as much as anything through my various duties for Ngaai Tahu. And I'd met Te Oe Davis and Nada Glavish and a bunch of Tai Tokoro tūpuna of hers at a hui in Gisborne, I think, to do with the Māori affairs. And I'm just trying to think of the far north Kaumatua, the old man. I can see them. And I can't pull their names back. But
is there a memory that you had?
But anyhow, these gatherings brought me into contact with Horry Forbes. His wife was a close relation.
Huia.
Huia, yes. And she had a mother, I think it was an aunt of Taui's. Anyhow, that nexus, that frame, is where I first heard reference to Bob when he'd come home. Now, I don't think I ever heard Horry say he's keeping the seat warm for Bob. But in the days when they were all talking about succession, right, left and centre, it was anticipated that Bob would take over the leadership of the Tainui Maori Trust Board.
And that would have been back in the day when Horry travelled around in his car with all the trust board minutes in his boot, those old minutes. Because I can recall Horry visiting Sir Robert up in Auckland and opening his boot to show him whatever was happening on the trust board. In terms of that first impression of Sir Robert, what was your first impression when you met him face to face?
Well, I wasn't that impressed. He believed in double vowels being printed, and I believed in macrons. And it seemed to me to be nonsense to do this, because when you took TAUA, it could be a possessive noun, it could be the two of us, but it could also be, it's also the Ngaai Tahu word for your grandmother. But then I found that a whole lot of those phrases that we use in the far south, tā kuri for a pup, and those words to be found up in Nuhaka. Auntie Sophie Carr kept telling me about them. And so that started me thinking. But to come back to Robert Mahuta, he was a very active intelligence, clearly had the capacity for leadership. But a lot of the things he was doing on the side, in the course of it, I had quite severe reservations about. But they're not the sort of things that you'd break up a contact with over. But one of my colleagues was Ted Douglas, who you may remember, who was a professor of geography, I think, at Waikato. Well, Whitu Tirakatini always said he was Ngaai Tahu, but I never saw a sign of any whakapapa reference for him.
Would it be right to
Ted had a great devotion to Bob.
Would it be right to characterise the nature of your relationship, especially during the negotiating period, as holding each other intellectually accountable? Because
I think that's a fair description, because we could debate those questions, but we very seldom came to any significant conflicts, except that some things he would disregard that I regarded as very important, and perhaps vice versa. But I don't think we ever had much in the way of direct conflict. Not that I recall. I remember at Waihi at his tangi, though, I had the opportunity on my feet out there. I remember standing under the sun with a couple of buckets of titi waiting behind me to present this koha. I was able to get a few things off my chest. And I pointed out without fear of any rebuttal. But when I came up, Raiha said, "Oh, Tipene, you were so right, you were so right." She said a couple of rude words about him, and she was entitled to.
Yes. Well, there was a healthy respect, certainly, between houses and whānau for the nature of your relationship, which brings me to people in and around you both. I think about Te Ata. Te Ata had a very healthy respect for the way in which you both led out and always would listen to the debate that was being I guess, hosted in public when it came to the treaty settlement process and public education that you were both undertaking. Were there moments in your relationship with Te Ata, for example, where you sought counsel from her or you shared things with her?
I've got one recollection, my strongest reflection. We were both sitting on the bank above the edge of the beach at Waitangi in the Bay of Islands, she and I. And we would have talked for probably 2 hours or more. She was asking me questions and I was responding and I was asking her questions. And we got up in the end and walked across to the bottom marae around to the kota. And she poked her head in the door, caused a total, absolute explosion of anxiety right through the kitchen. When she put her hand up, said, "Any chance of a cup of tea?" And we sat in the back of the kota, the bottom marae, Waitangi, and had a cup of tea. But that conversation, I can't remember a lot of it, but I know it was marked by a great strength and warmth. She talked about Te Puia, and I talked about pay. She told me about how she felt about pay to her nei. E pounamu te mahara. Well, I loved her manner of operating. But I was always very deeply grateful for the consideration and kindness she showed our Hana here. Hana rang us one day and said, "I'm at Auntie Ata's. All the old women are talking in the kitchen, so I've got Auntie Taue's phone." Yeah. And I thought to myself, that's a very generous and nice thing to have your child in that sort of association of groups.
You mentioned Te Aue. Te Aue was very close to Te Ata.
Yes.
And she was also someone that you knew very well as also. And Te Aue was, my observation of Te Aue around Te Ata was she was a very constant and steady support. And Te Ata sought counsel from wise heads like Te Aue, and also the pukinga that she held.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Well, Te Aue became very important. She lived at our home for some time when she was doing that wonderful work with Bill Robertson at the Geographic Board. He was the Surveyor General and she was doing the Oral History Atlas of New Zealand and the little place names book. They're very special little publications and they're due to be reprinted again shortly. But that was very much her creative side.
And she was a gifted weaver as well.
Oh, yes.
I recollect being with Te Ata at the Halberg Awards and Te Aue had weaved the kakahu that the Olympic team have, the very first kakahu, and Te Ata named that korowai mahutonga. But she was very fond of Te Aue, and in terms of these...
Te Aue is a very sharp cookie. And that's why Hori Forbes was so close to her. That's where I always used to meet Hori.
And I was going to actually go into that. These characters that were around before you met Sir Robert, that you had a relationship with, was it mainly to do with, like Hori, with the trust board?
Yes, the trust board ideas, issues. Te Aue quite often arranged our meetings, my meetings with Hori. He wanted to talk to me about trust board stuff we're dealing with, how we're going to handle koro in the next round.
Did it work?
Yes, generally. Oh no, the relationship with koro was very special. He said, "How the hell can you expect me to have a seat on the Geographic Names Board just for Ngaai Tahu? I said, because there's no other iwi in the country with as many place names in their kete as we have to deal with. And we've got more to restore than any other part of the country. It's just because there's more of it and there's fewer of us and so on. And he said, that sounds a perfectly good argument. And before very long, in the Ngaai Tahu settlement, we had membership of the Geographic Board and a seat on the New Zealand Conservation Authority.
Did you ever sit on the Board of Māori Affairs?
No,
Never.
no. Joe Karatai did all that stuff. Yeah. I never had any ambition to, I must say. I always seemed to have enough on my plate.
And in terms of the personalities that were around that influenced your thinking from across the motu, was there anyone else that comes to mind? That you...
Oh, yes, I was influenced quite strongly by one of my own generation, was Api Mahuika, Monita Delamere, the judge, the district courts now, the head of the district courts.
Hemi Taumanu.
Hemi Tomanu, his father. And Rangi Pōkehā from the Whanganui River, Koroniti. He had a very deep impact upon us. When Hana was just a little toddler, the old man he'd come down to our place from my kirikiri. It was too cold up there in the winter. He'd come down to our place and he'd sit in the big room and he'd sit in the morning and look out the bay window and sing to the ships as they passed in and out of the harbour. But quite often you'd come out and you'd find him sitting with this one on his knee.
Beyond the relationship, was there a special role that Te Aue played in terms of informing the mahi that was being done in Ngaai Tahu for the settlement?
Oh, yes, but Te Aue was largely driven because she was the custodian of her late father's papers. And she spent an awful lot of time working on those papers, both translating them and working with them. So she was already a very, very literate woman. But she did a huge amount of that for us as well. Once we worked out and negotiated the terms of the apology document, the Te Reo version was produced by Te Aue. We had the deed of settlement document translated into Te Reo by Te Aue for us. We were deeply indebted to her, but she was a very dear friend to the late Bill Solomon from Oaru and Kaikoura. Now, Bill was on the Ngaai Tahu Trust Board with me, but he's the man who founded Whale Watch Kaikoura, who basically initiated and built the marae takahanga. I was just the go-getter who to go out and recover the land for them to build it on, the old power site, and do various things of that kind. But she spent weeks sitting with Bill, working through Hariata Whakatau's papers and things of that kind. And we treasured that relationship with her. She was a very gifted woman.
Again, another generous contributor to, te ao Māori.
Oh, absolutely. Generosity of spirit driven by her extraordinary competencies. I think that's fair to say.
Kia ora. I want to thank you for your contribution and leadership to New Zealand and the intellectual rigour and innovation that you brought to the treaty settlement space, but also the generosity of spirit that you've had around this reflective time to ask questions within ourselves as te iwi Māori about what this future looks like. Is there anything you think is important to consider in terms of where we are now and where we need to be that you'd like to share?
I think it's very important that Te Ao Māori evolves for itself a clear view of how it wants Aotearoa New Zealand to be, because then you know to some degree how you want to be to belong to it. So we've got to go beyond ourselves to understand what we are going to be as a nation. We are too large a component of it to allow it just to go from tide to tide, letting others determine its shape and place. We need to have a view as Māori of how we want the nation to be so we can better understand our place in it. And that involves, at its very core, our relationships with each other. Māori ki te Māori, Māori ki te Pākehā, e kaupapa rua o tātou.
Tēnā koe te rangatira mō tēnei wāhanga ki te noho ki tō taha. Me he mea he kōrero hei whakakapi hei aki i ngā mokopuna kei a koe tēnei wā. Ka waihotia ki konei.
Tēnā koe, ka tika hoki tō whakaro tō taimai ki konei, I raru te maru o tēnei whare. Ka te whakapūpū nea hau. Ka te kitiki a koe, mō tō mahi o mua. Ano, I roto ka tini mahara o tō whānau, o tō iwi, o tō marae. Ka ti.